They say some families are blessed and others are cursed. But what if I told you that somewhere in the backwoods of early America, a family existed that seemed to carry something inhuman in their blood, a sickness of the soul that passed from one generation to the next, not through choice, not through sin, but through blood itself. The story you're about to hear was never meant to survive. It was whispered through diary fragments, forgotten census records, and the crumbling walls of a farmhouse that locals still refuse to go near. Even now, the land feels wrong, like something beneath the soil remembers what happened there. They called them the Whitlocks, a name that once stood for pride, faith, and the frontier spirit. But by the time the 20th century began, that name had turned into something people only muttered when the wind was low and the night was long, because the Whitlocks weren't just another American family. They were the kind of story parents used to frighten their children into staying close to home. No one knew exactly when the first signs of the curse began. Some say it started with a promise made in 1839, when Thomas Whitlock, a settler from Virginia, built his home on stolen land. The native elders had warned him not to disturb what they called the hollow of the sleeping ones. But Thomas laughed, cut down the ancient oak, and built his foundation right over it. That night, the sky turned red, and the family dog went missing. By morning, Thomas's wife was found at the well, whispering that something had followed the roots into the house. From that moment on, the Whitlocks were never the same. Every generation grew more isolated, more twisted in mind and spirit. Neighbors stopped visiting. Mail stopped coming. Children were born with strange eyes, odd tempers, and a fear of mirrors. And yet the records show something far more disturbing. The Whitlocks knew what was happening. They documented every symptom, every nightmare, every death, as if they were waiting for someone to find it all. Someone like us. Tonight, we open their forgotten ledger, and what we'll find written inside may change the way you think about family forever. The Whitlock family's descent didn't happen all at once. It was slow, patient, like rot spreading through the beams of a house no one remembers to look at. The earliest surviving account comes from 1842, written by Thomas Whitlock's eldest daughter, Mary. Her handwriting, delicate and trembling, speaks of nights when the house would breathe. She wrote about hearing the walls sigh when the candles went out, about footsteps in the hallway when everyone was asleep, and then about her father, standing at the foot of her bed one morning, dirt under his fingernails, whispering that he'd heard the roots calling again. Mary's journal stops abruptly that winter. A single final entry reads, "The earth is taking him back." A week later, Thomas was found half buried in the field behind the house, his mouth filled with soil, his eyes open. No one ever figured out how he got there. His wife, Eleanor, told the neighbors it was the land claiming its due. And after his burial, Eleanor shut herself inside the farmhouse and began painting symbols on the doors, protective marks, she called them. She burned sage until the air grew thick and choked. The surviving children, Samuel and Ruth, were rarely seen again. Some said Eleanor had lost her mind. Others said she'd seen something she could never unsee. By 1860, the family's name had almost vanished from town records. The Whitlock farm stopped paying taxes, and no one dared to collect. Travelers passing through the region described hearing faint singing in the cornfields, even in the dead of winter. One man claimed to see a child's face pressed against the upstairs window, though the house had been empty for decades. But the Whitlocks weren't gone, far from it. Buried within a church archive in Roanoke lies a letter, dated 1893, from a Reverend Harlan Pierce. In it, he begs for guidance, writing that the Whitlock descendants carry something unholy, not of God nor of man. He claimed one of them had come to him in confession saying she'd seen the family tree whisper. No one knows what Reverend Pierce meant by that. The letter ends mid-sentence, but his handwriting, jagged and desperate, looks almost identical to Mary Whitlock's 50 years before. By the turn of the century, the Whitlocks had become a ghost story, one whispered by men in saloons and by children around campfires. But the family wasn't gone. They had simply gone quiet. Their last known descendants, 3 siblings, Jeremiah, Leela, and Andrew, lived alone on what was left of the family land. The farmhouse sagged under years of neglect, its windows dark, its roof lined with moss and the slow creep of time. The locals avoided that stretch of road, not because of superstition, but because of what they'd seen. The smoke from the Whitlock chimney burned gray in the day and black at night. Some nights, people swore it smelled like burnt iron. Others said it carried a sweetness that made the air taste wrong. One autumn, a census taker was sent to record the household. He never returned. His notebook was found months later near the property line, pages torn, words written in frantic loops. They're not alone. The trees, they know their names. Leila Whitlock's diary, found years later inside a rusted trunk, gives us the clearest window into their isolation. Her entries are both tender and terrifying, a woman documenting her sanity slipping through her fingers. She wrote of her brother Jeremiah waking each night to stand in the fields, staring at something no one else could see, of her younger brother Andrew digging holes at the edge of the woods and saying, "We're making room." The final entries read like the unraveling of a mind, or a revelation. The house hums when it rains. Jeremiah says we must go below the roots. There's a door in the cellar now. After that, nothing. When authorities finally searched the property in 1911, they found no trace of the siblings, only open ground, disturbed earth, and a cellar door bricked shut from the inside. No remains, no furniture, not even dust. It was as if the house had exhaled them. The Whitlock name disappeared from every local record by 1913, but not from memory, because people kept hearing that hum, the same low vibration that Lila wrote about, rolling through the fields whenever it rained, like something beneath the soil remembering. And somewhere, beneath that bricked cellar, the curse waited, patient, hungry, and unfinished. For decades, the Whitlock land sat empty, a scar on the map that no one dared to claim. But curses don't die with silence, they hibernate. And in 1952, the name surfaced again. A man named Henry Whitlock, claiming to be the great-grandson of Thomas, purchased the property through a rural land auction. No one knew where he'd come from. His paperwork was immaculate, his manners quiet and polite, but the locals said his eyes had that same pale hue people remembered from old portraits, a color too light, too cold. Henry moved into the farmhouse that same spring. Within months, strange things began again. The soil refused to grow anything, the well water turned black, and the neighbors heard voices, children laughing softly at night, though Henry lived alone. He never spoke to anyone except for the postmaster, who once delivered a parcel to him and said the inside of the house smelled of wet stone and mildew. He also claimed that Henry's reflection in the window didn't quite move right. By 1954, letters began appearing in the local newspaper, written anonymously, always signed with the same phrase, "The roots remember." They spoke of an old promise being kept, and the blood that would not end. Investigators later traced the handwriting to Henry's typewriter. But by the time they reached the house, he was gone. Inside, they found something impossible. The walls were covered in family trees, drawn in red ink. Each branch had a name, some were crossed out, others were circled in a trembling hand, and at the very bottom one name was written over and over, Eleanor. Pinned to the kitchen door was a note. It said, "She's still in the roots." Beneath the floorboards, they discovered a cellar that hadn't existed before, a narrow descent carved deep into the earth. At the end of it, a single wooden chair sat facing the dirt wall. On the wall was a carving, a woman's face, mouth open, eyes hollowed out. Beneath it, the same words again, "The roots remember." No trace of Henry was ever found. But that year, the nearby town suffered a sudden rash of disappearances, mostly children, and locals swore that when the wind came down from the old Whitlock land, it carried laughter. By the 1970s, the Whitlock story had become little more than a rural myth, the kind of tale told to keep kids from sneaking out at night. But myths have a way of leaking into truth when someone decides to dig deep enough. That someone was Dr. Franklin Morrow, a folklore historian from the University of Virginia. He'd heard whispers of the cursed family that ate its own bloodline and wanted to trace the legend back to fact. He should have stopped at the whispers. Dr. Morrow's notes, recovered after his disappearance, describe a visit to the Whitlock property in 1974. He wrote that the air tasted metallic and that his compass wouldn't settle. Beneath the collapsed farmhouse, he discovered the remains of a root system unlike anything he'd ever seen, thick, black veins that pulsed faintly in the dark. When he cut one open, it bled. That night, his tape recorder captured something impossible, a voice, faint, layered, reciting names. The Whitlock names, generations of them. When Morrow played it back, he swore he could hear his own name whispered at the end. Weeks later, his research assistant found his notes scattered across his apartment floor. The last page was smeared with something dark. One line stood out clearly. They were never people. They were soil given shape. The Whitlock land was condemned soon after, fenced off by the state. No official reason was ever given. But for years afterward, locals reported government vehicles visiting the site at night, hauling away crates marked BOHUZARDIWONG-OFEWIDU. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run from it, or try to understand what it made you? Because here's the truth, most people can't face the Whitlocks didn't just vanish. The bloodline didn't end. In 1989, a birth certificate was found in Richmond, Virginia. The child of Eleanor Whitlock III, No father listed, no burial record, just a note in the margin in faded ink, returned to the soil. Someone out there carries that name today. Maybe they don't even know what they are. Maybe they've heard the hum in their dreams, the whisper in their garden at night, and maybe they're watching this video right now. Not far from the old Whitlock land lies the remains of a place once called Hollow's Bend. It doesn't appear on any modern map, but if you look at survey records from before 1900, you'll find it marked. A small community built around a sawmill, a church, and a single road that ran straight into Whitlock territory. Locals said the town existed only to serve the family, that the Whitlocks had funded it, staffed it, and kept it alive as long as the bloodline stayed strong. When the family began to die out, so did the town. Storefronts closed overnight. Wells dried up. The air thickened with the smell of sulfur and decay. By 1925, Hollow's Bend was deserted, but people who stumbled across the ruins decades later described something unnatural. The buildings were intact, untouched by time. Dishes still on tables, lamps still filled with oil. It was as if everyone had simply stood up one day and walked into the woods, leaving their lives mid-breath. In 1993, a group of urban explorers found their way into Hollow's Bend. They filmed what they saw. Fragments of it survived online for a few days before being deleted. But the recovered audio remains: faint breathing and a man whispering. It's humming underground. Buried in the footage, there's a glimpse of a wooden sign nailed to a door. The words are barely legible, but they match the handwriting found in Henry Whitlock's house decades earlier. It reads, "The roots remember the town." 2. When the footage resurfaced on a conspiracy forum years later, commenters point out something none of the explorers ever noticed. In the background, through the window of the old church, there's a figure. Small, watching. Its eyes gleam like glass even in the dark. Authorities later claimed the explorers never returned home. Their vehicle was found abandoned, parked neatly at the edge of the Whitlock property. Doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Inside, a single cassette tape was left in the dashboard. The tape contained a woman's voice, calm and steady. "It isn't a curse," she said. "It's a calling." No one has ever identified the voice, but according to voice analysis records from the case file, the pattern, tone, and cadence bore a 99% match to Leela Whitlock, a woman who'd been missing for over 80 years. There's one last piece to this story, the part no one was meant to find. In 2006, a private contractor clearing land near Hollow's Bend uncovered something beneath a collapsed barn. He thought it was an old cellar, but when he climbed down, he found a tunnel, carved deep into the earth, lined with wood so old it flaked apart at his touch. He followed it for nearly 30 yards before he saw it, a wall of roots, thick as tree trunks, pulsing slowly, like veins under skin. At the center was something buried, the shape of a human body or close to it. The chest rose and fell as if breathing. The contractor ran, called the sheriff, and never went back. When a county team returned to investigate, the tunnel was gone. The ground had collapsed overnight. The official report said it was unstable soil conditions. But the man who found it didn't sleep for weeks. He said he could still hear it. A heartbeat in the ground, following him wherever he went, and then he vanished. The Whitlock curse, it seems, was never really about death. It was about continuance. A kind of life that refused to end, a hunger written into the roots of the land itself, something born from human greed and sealed with generations of silence. The Whitlocks didn't summon it, they became it. The soil took their names, their flesh, their memories, and turned them into something eternal. If you drive past the old Whitlock property today, you won't see a house. You'll see grass, trees, maybe a broken fence line. But sometimes, when the air is still and the rain begins to fall, the ground ripples just slightly, as if something beneath it shifts in its sleep. The locals don't go near it. The mailmen won't drive that road. GPS signals drop and phones lose reception. But the sound remains, that faint hum, that breathing earth. And every few years, someone with the last name Whitlock applies for a birth certificate in a nearby county. No father listed, no mother's maiden name, just the same signature written in shaky, fading ink. The roots remember. Because the truth is, the curse was never buried. It's waiting, growing, reaching toward the surface again, and one day soon it's going to remember you.